Hey, come in, get settled, dim whatever needs dimming. Tonight isn't about the mysteries you already know the shape of. It's about the ones sitting just outside the light, of the ones everybody talks about, the questions that never got their own thread, never got their own theory video, because they were standing in the shadow of bigger, louder mysteries. Some of these were sitting in plain sight the entire run of the show, glimpsed once in a single frame and never mentioned again. Some of them only became visible years after the finale aired, once a spin-off or a comic or a stray interview quietly reopened a door everyone assumed had been sealed for good. We're going to spend the next couple of hours down there with them, moving slowly, letting each one sit for as long as it needs to before we follow it toward whatever it's actually pointing at. Let's start with a photograph. There is a picture on the wall of Simon Petrikov's apartment, glimpsed in the background of a handful of scenes set before the Mushroom War. It shows Simon and Betty together, the two of them young and unmarked by any of what's coming, and standing near them, close enough to be part of the frame on purpose, is a third figure. Nobody in the show has ever named this figure. Nobody in the show has ever explained why it's there. Adam Muto, one of the people who ran Adventure Time, in its later years, was eventually asked about it directly, and his answer was not an answer so much as a shrug wearing the clothes of an answer. He said it was, in his words, some sort of cryptid. That's it. That's the whole explanation. A cryptid, a creature that has supposedly been sighted, but whose existence has never been confirmed. A word usually reserved for things like lake monsters and forest apes, deployed here to describe a shape standing in a family photograph on the wall of a man who would go on to lose his mind to a magic crown and forget the two people standing next to him in that exact picture. Sit with that for a second, because it deserves more than a second. Somebody at the studio drew that figure into the background of Simon's photograph deliberately. Somebody chose its silhouette, its posture, the fact that it belongs in frame rather than being an accident of composition. And then, when a fan finally noticed and finally asked, the answer that came back wasn't a piece of lore. It was an acknowledgement that the thing exists and a refusal to say what it is. That is a different kind of mystery than most of what gets asked about this show. Most unsolved things in Adventure Time are unsolved because the story ran out of episodes before it could get to them, or because the writers changed their minds about a plan mid-run and quietly buried the earlier version. This one feels different. This one feels like a secret that was built to stay a secret, a small, locked room bricked into the wall of a much larger house, put there on purpose by people who had every intention of never opening it for anyone. There are a few directions the speculation tends to go, and I want to be honest about the fact that none of them are confirmed, that all of them are exactly what they sound like, guesses built from adjacent lore, offered without any claim to being the real answer. One direction points toward the general strangeness of the pre-war world Simon inhabited as an antiquarian, a man whose entire profession was built around handling objects and creatures nobody else understood, which means a cryptid in his personal life wouldn't necessarily be out of place. Maybe a pet, maybe a research subject, maybe a family friend from a stranger corner of that world than the show ever otherwise showed us. Another direction points towards something less literal, the idea that the figure is a visual joke buried for the animator's own amusement, the kind of thing background artists sometimes slip into a frame because they know that somewhere out there, someone is going to pause the video and squint. Adventure Time's crew did this constantly. Hidden references, in-jokes meant for exactly one rewatch in 1,000. It's entirely possible the cryptid is nothing more than that. A wink aimed at nobody in particular, later retrofitted with a real-sounding explanation, because the alternative was admitting there wasn't one. But I want to offer you a third way of looking at it, one that isn't a theory about what the creature is so much as a theory about what its presence is doing to the scene. Simon Petrikov's tragedy, as the show eventually reveals it in full, is a tragedy of erasure. He loses his own past so completely that when Marceline sings his own handwriting back to him centuries later, he doesn't recognize a word of it. The crown doesn't just change what he looks like, it erases the evidence of who he used to be, piece by piece, until only the objects around him, the photographs, the tapes, the notes he left himself before he understood what he was losing, carry any proof that the man in them ever existed. A photograph with an unexplained figure in it fits that theme almost too well. It's a document from a life Simon can no longer verify, containing a detail even the audience can't verify, doubling the erasure. We don't just lose access to who that creature was. We lose access to whether knowing would have even mattered. The mystery isn't a puzzle waiting for a solution. It's a formal echo of the show's actual subject, which is what gets left behind when memory stops being reliable, and whether the things left behind are enough to reconstruct a person from. I don't think the show ever intended for anyone to solve this. I think it intended for you to notice it, feel the itch of it, and then keep watching, carrying that itch forward, the way you carry every unanswered question a good story leaves in your hands. That's worth naming clearly, because a lot of what we're going to walk through tonight works the same way. These aren't gaps the writers meant to fill later and never got around to. Some of them, this one especially, feel like gaps built into the architecture on purpose, load-bearing absences, holes that are doing work precisely because nothing fills them. Go ahead and drop a comment if you feel like it. Tell me where you're watching from tonight and what time it is where you are. I like knowing there are people scattered across a dozen different time zones, all of them lying in the dark with this same show playing, all of them a few hours apart from each other in ways that don't matter at all once the theme song starts. It's a small thing, but it's a real one, and it's nice to know you're out there. Let's stay with Simon and Betty a little longer, because the photograph isn't the only unresolved thread hanging off their story, and the next one is bigger, stranger, and, depending on how seriously you take licensed comic continuity, potentially a direct contradiction of everything the television finale spent 10 years building toward. Betty Groff, in the finale of the original series, makes a choice that the show frames as the single greatest sacrifice any character makes across the entire run. Inside the body of the chaos entity called Golb, with Simon finally stripped of the crown and restored to himself for the first time in 1,000 years, Betty uses the crown's wish-granting power to protect him, and in doing so she fuses with Golb itself, becoming a new being, the show, and its fandom referred to as Gol Betty, chaos incarnate, now carrying Betty's intellect and something of her intention inside it, no longer fully a person in any way Simon can reach. The show doesn't undo this. It doesn't rescue her in a last-minute twist. It lets the cost stand. Simon is free, Simon is himself, and Simon is alone, and that unresolved ache is precisely the note the main series chooses to end on for this particular story. It's devastating specifically because it isn't fixed, except that in 2025, a new line of Adventure Time comics from Oni Press rebooted the continuity of the printed material, and in the 6th issue of that new run, something happened that the animated canon never allowed. A flashback reveals that in this comic timeline, Simon and Betty were never separated at all. They stayed together straight through the apocalypse. They raised Marceline together as a pair during the exact stretch of time the show always depicted Simon handling alone. And most strikingly, the flashback implies that Simon either never put the crown on before this point or wasn't affected by it the way he was in the show's version of events, with Betty explicitly warning him inside the scene not to wear it, telling him plainly that he'll lose himself if he does, while Simon argues that wearing it is the only way to protect the two people he loves most in a ruined world full of goo zombies and radiation and things with no name yet. I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of detail where speculation needs a very clear label, and I'm going to give it one. It is not settled publicly whether this comic continuity is meant to sit alongside the animated series as a parallel telling, the kind of alternate universe storytelling Adventure Time has always been comfortable with through its multiverse mechanics, or whether it's simply a soft reboot that quietly declines to acknowledge the television finale's version of events at all. There's an earlier precedent for this kind of tension, too, a different comic continuation called Marcy and Simon, which followed up on the original animated finale and depicted Marceline and Simon going on an apology tour together across Ooh, eventually finding a way to rescue Betty from her existence as Golb and reunite her with Simon for good. That story reads as a direct sequel to the finale, an attempt to give the two of them the ending the television series withheld. But by the time the 2025 relaunch arrived with its very different flashback, in which Betty was never lost in the first place, it became genuinely unclear whether Marcy and Simon still counts as canon, whether it's been quietly retired, or whether it exists in a timeline separate from both the show and the new comics, unconnected to either. What we're left with, honestly, is 3 different, mutually exclusive versions of what happened to Betty Gruff. In one, she sacrifices herself and becomes Gol Betty, and Simon lives out his remaining years without her, grieving in the specific, quiet way the Fiona and Cake spin-off eventually shows him learning to carry. In another, she's rescued from that fate entirely, restored to her human self, and reunited with Simon after his own journey of healing. And in a third, none of that ever needed to happen, because she was never separated from him to begin with, and the entire architecture of loss that defines Simon's character in the original series simply didn't occur in this telling. Here's where I land on it, and I want to flag clearly that this next part is interpretation, not fact. Three versions like this don't cancel each other out, and they don't need a fourth twist to reconcile them, because Adventure Time built an entire cosmology through Prismo and the multiverse mechanics revealed across its later seasons that treats alternate timelines as genuinely real rather than as narrative dead ends. A universe exists where the Lich never came into being and Simon dies stopping the bomb. A universe exists where vampires conquered Ooh. A universe existed, hidden inside Simon's own damaged mind, that turned out to be entirely real once someone finally looked closely enough. Given that established grammar, a timeline where Betty and Simon were never parted isn't necessarily a contradiction that needs resolving. It might simply be another branch, another shape on that holographic map the Enchiridion is able to display, sitting quietly alongside the one we watched for 10 seasons, equally real, equally true, just not the one the cameras happen to follow. Whether the people currently writing the comics intend it that way is something only they can answer, and as far as I know, nobody's asked them directly. But it's a genuinely open question, sitting right there in officially published material, and it deserves to be named as one rather than smoothed over. What both versions of Betty share, regardless of which one you choose to hold on to, is the shape of a woman who spent centuries refusing to accept the ending she'd been handed. Whether she gets there by loving Simon steadily across an unbroken lifetime, or by tearing through time itself to reach a man who no longer remembers her name, the through line doesn't change. She is the one person in this entire mythology who looked at loss and decided more than once, in more than one version of events, that it wasn't going to be the final word. It's worth circling back, briefly, to where we started tonight, because that unnamed cryptid standing in Simon and Betty's photograph takes on a slightly different weight once you know their relationship itself has been rewritten at least twice across different pieces of official material. If the animated series and the newer comics genuinely represent two separate branches of the same multiverse the show spent its final seasons building out, then it's entirely possible that photograph and the figure standing in it comes from a version of Simon's life neither the show nor the comics ever fully depicted on their own, a third branch, glimpsed only in that single background image, never elaborated on anywhere else, its own small, permanently sealed room sitting quietly behind two much larger, much better documented ones. I want to be clear. This is pure speculation, offered because it's the kind of connection this show's own cosmology makes newly possible, rather than because any piece of official material actually draws the line for you. But once a franchise establishes that alternate versions of the same two people's love story can exist side by side, unreconciled, equally real, it becomes very hard to look at any single unexplained detail from their shared history as fully isolated ever again. There's a related piece of theorizing that Betty's own research makes almost impossible to avoid, and it's worth pulling all the way out into the open rather than letting it stay buried in the corners of Simon and Marceline's story or the show first introduces it. At some point after her disappearance from Simon's life, Betty begins investigating what she comes to call magic, madness, and sadness, a theory developed through her own study of wizards and spellcasters across O that using magical power inevitably comes bundled with a kind of psychological cost. Madness on one side of the ledger, grief on the other, with the two feeding each other in a cycle that never seems to break cleanly for anyone who wears power like a crown or a hat or a staff. It's not framed in the show as an abstract academic theory. It's framed as something Betty needs to be true, or rather, needs to understand well enough to defeat, because the specific madness she's studying is the specific madness eating her fiancé alive 1 century at a time. What's never fully answered, and what I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets, is how far this rule actually reaches. The show gives us wizard after wizard whose lives seem to prove Betty's theory correct almost by accident. Magic Man, before he became Magic Man, was an ordinary, contented Martian named after nothing more dramatic than his own name, married to a woman called Margles, living what the show implies was a stable, even joyful life. Then Golb attacked Mars, took Margles along with a great many other Martians, and the loss broke something in him that magic alone couldn't fix and arguably made worse. He built a weapon shaped like his dead wife's memory, called it MARGLES, a planetary defense system whose very name spells out an acronym for Magical Automated Resistance Generating Laser Energy Supplier, engineered specifically to guard Mars against any future attack from Golby, the same entity that had taken Margles from him in the first place and let his grief curdle into 200 years of increasingly deranged cruelty toward anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Cruelty that reads, on close inspection, less like villainy and more like a man who never got the chance to grieve properly and instead let the grief harden into every other available shape. His own brothers watched this happen and warned him explicitly that his emotional state was compromising his magic and would eventually compromise the very weapon meant to protect their planet. He didn't listen, and the compromise happened almost exactly as predicted. At the moment of activation, standing atop the same mountain where he'd once shared a night with his wife, before everything went wrong, Magic Man tried to use the completed weapon to somehow restore her, instead of simply defending the planet, and the resulting confrontation destroyed MARGLES entirely while leaving lasting damage to his own already fragile psychology. What became of the weapon's remains, whether any piece of it survived that destruction in a form still capable of doing what it was built for, and whether Mars, all these centuries later, still stands without the planetary defense its own king once tried and failed to build in his murdered wife's image, is never addressed again anywhere in the show. Mars simply goes on existing, apparently undefended, its people trusting instead in whichever member of a large, strange, occasionally squabbling family happens to be sitting on the throne in a given era. Marceline, meanwhile, sits at an uncomfortable angle to Betty's theory because she isn't technically a wizard by the show's usual definitions, and yet she carries centuries of exactly the pattern Betty describes, enormous power acquired through violence and survival, an unresolved relationship with grief that runs the entire length of her existence, periods of instability that the show is careful never to pathologize directly, but never quite lets you forget either. If magic, madness, and sadness is a universal law rather than a wizard-specific one, Marceline is either an exception the show never explains, or she's living proof that the rule applies more broadly than Betty's research ever framed it, extending to anyone who trades ordinary mortality for extraordinary power, regardless of the specific mechanism involved. The show never settles this. It never has a character say the rule out loud and then test it against Marceline directly. It just leaves both pieces of evidence sitting in the same mythology, unreconciled, and trusts you to notice the tension if you're paying close enough attention across enough seasons to hold both threads in your head at once. I want to be plain that everything in the last two paragraphs beyond the specific, stated events is interpretation. The show states, through Betty's own research, that magic tends to produce madness and sadness in its users. It does not state a precise mechanism, does not state whether the rule is absolute or probabilistic, does not state whether non-wizard forms of power acquisition are covered by the same principle. What we have is a pattern, repeated across multiple characters, strong enough to notice, never quite confirmed as an ironclad law of the universe. That's the honest shape of it. Let's go further out, because there's an entire corner of this mythology that mostly lives in a single, deeply strange episode, and it deserves more room than the one appearance it got, because the implications of it stretch much further than the episode itself ever had time to explore. Mars is real in the Adventure Time universe, not metaphorically, not as some kind of dream logic detour, but as an actual functioning planet with its own government, its own history, its own gods, connected to Earth by a transporter device that a handful of characters use across a handful of episodes, without most viewers ever fully registering what a large claim that is about the scale of this show's cosmology. Ruling over Mars, at least for a stretch of the show's history, is a four-headed entity known as Grob, Gob, Glob, Grod, not four separate beings, but a single deity with four heads, four distinct personalities, occupying one shared body, worshipped by the residents of the land of U as a kind of folk god, referenced constantly in phrases like, "Oh my glob," that most characters use the way people in our world casually say, "Oh my God," without necessarily meaning anything theological by it. Here's the detail that tends to get lost, because it only shows up clearly if you follow the character across several episodes rather than watching them in isolation. Grob, Gob, Glob, Grod has siblings, and one of those siblings is Magic Man, the same grieving, deranged, 200 years exiled Martian we just spent time with a few minutes ago. The show reveals, once you connect these episodes to each other, that Magic Man's entire arc, from contented husband to grieving weapon builder to banished madman to eventual king of Mars himself, plays out entirely within a single extended Martian family, watched over by siblings who exiled him for his own good, who never stopped calling him brother even while formally condemning him, and who eventually welcomed him back. not as a punishment lifted, but as a relationship repaired. And ruling above all of them, at least for a portion of this mythology's internal history, is a version of Abraham Lincoln. Yes, that Abraham Lincoln, rendered with startling fidelity to his real historical appearance, sitting on a throne on Mars, having apparently lived there for thousands of years as King of Mars, speaking in a casual, contemporary vernacular that has nothing to do with his actual 19th century speeches. The show never explains how the 16th president of the United States ended up ruling an alien planet for millennia. It simply presents this as a fact of its universe and moves forward, trusting that the sheer confidence of the presentation will carry you past the question of how it's possible, the same way it trusted you to accept a talking dog and a boy in a bear hat without demanding an origin story for either. What makes this Lincoln story worth sitting with, rather than just laughing at and moving on from, is how it ends. When Grob Gob Glob Grod mistakenly seizes Jake, believing him to be the disguised magic man, and accidentally kills him with a dropped ceremonial wand during what was meant to be a formal trial, Lincoln is faced with death itself, standing before him and offering the one and only trade that could bring Jake back. Lincoln first offers a penny, a callback to a joke that runs elsewhere through the show's mythology about the low value death sometimes accepts for a soul, and death, unmoved, simply laughs at him. So Lincoln offers the only thing left that might actually be worth Jake's life, his own immortality, built up and preserved across thousands of years of rule. He gives it up, on the spot, without visible hesitation, and the show marks the moment with the sound of a single gunshot fading out under the frame, an unmistakable, quiet echo of the real Lincoln's assassination, folded into a scene about an entirely different death, on an entirely different planet, a century and a half removed from the man it's referencing. He becomes a statue after that, a lifeless monument seated on his own throne, and Grob Gob Glob Grod ascends to rule Mars in his place. The show never brings him back. There's no resurrection episode waiting in the wings, no twist where the statue cracks open and Lincoln steps out restored. He stays a monument, permanently, a king who traded eternity for one dog's life and simply accepted the trade without asking for anything back. It's one of the strangest, quietest, most genuinely moving character deaths in the entire show, delivered inside an episode that is, by any reasonable measure, absurd on its surface, a body swap comedy involving a wand-wielding four-headed god and an alien courtroom. And the show never once undercuts the sincerity of the sacrifice by treating the surrounding absurdity as a reason not to take it seriously. That tension, comedy and genuine grief occupying the same scene without either one softening the other might be the single most consistent trick this show ever pulled, and this episode is one of its purest, least discussed examples. There's a small, almost throwaway piece of texture worth mentioning here too, mostly because of how strange it is that it exists at all within the same mythology as everything else we're covering tonight. Grob, Gob, Glob, Grod, despite ruling an entire planet and carrying the weight of everything we've just walked through, apparently also has a social life and it intersects, of all places, with Prismo's time room. The two of them are shown to be friends, close enough that Grob Gob Glob Grod turns up as a guest at a party Prismo throws at some point in the show's run, and while there, attempts without success to romantically pursue a water nymph named Denise, at one point apparently asking whether she'd be willing to date each of his four heads on a different day of the week, an offer that goes over about as well as you'd expect it to. It's a small, purely comedic beat, the kind of detail that exists mostly to make you laugh once and move on, and I don't want to overstate its significance. But it's worth noting anyway, because it's a reminder that even the show's largest, strangest cosmic entities are never treated as purely functional pieces of mythology. They have friendships, they have embarrassing romantic failures, they get invited to parties and say the wrong thing while they're there. Adventure Time never really distinguished between the scale of a character's cosmic importance and the ordinary, occasionally humiliating texture of just being a person trying to get along with other people, and Grob Gob Glob Grod's failed pitch to Denise is as good an example of that instinct as anything else we've covered tonight. And there's one more sighting of him worth flagging precisely because of how easy it is to miss. In the series finale, tucked into the background of a scene set inside BMO's own house, sits Grob Gob Glob Grod's helmet, simply present, undiscussed, unexplained, resting somewhere among the accumulated belongings of a small robot who has spent the entire series quietly absorbing pieces of everyone else's story into their own home. Nobody in the finale draws attention to it. No character picks it up, asks about it, or explains how it got there. It's the kind of detail that exists purely for the people willing to pause the frame, a single object suggesting an entire, unwritten story about how a piece of Martian royal regalia ended up sitting in a treehouse on Earth, in the home of a character who never once, across the entire run of the show, travels to Mars themselves. Maybe it was a gift, maybe it was found. Maybe it's simply proof that BMO's house, like this entire mythology, is quietly larger on the inside than anyone watching in real time ever had the chance to fully take in. There's a smaller detail buried in this same corner of the mythology that fans have picked at for years without ever getting a clean answer, and I want to give it its due, clearly labeled as the speculation it is. Grob Gob Glob Grod, at one point, refers to Jake in his true dog form as the one you were prophesied to meet, a single line delivered without elaboration, implying some larger destiny connecting Jake to the Martian gods that the show never circles back to explain. Around the same episode, hidden in a title card, packed with symbolic imagery, there's a petroglyph depicting figures that correspond to Magic Man, the Martian transporter, Jake, Grob Gob Glob Grod, and Abraham Lincoln, all connected by lines suggesting some larger, ancient pattern that predates the events we're watching. What that prophecy actually is, who recorded it, how long it's existed, and whether it was ever fulfilled or is still waiting to be. None of it is stated anywhere in the show. It's a genuinely unsolved thread, planted deliberately, referenced exactly once, and then simply left there, unlit, for anyone patient enough to notice it. There's a small object sitting at the center of Orgalorg's own defeat that carries its own quiet, unresolved question, one worth naming before we move any further from this corner of the mythology. The weapon used to cast Orgalorg down to earth in the first place, back before recorded history, back before Lincoln, back before any of the events the show ever actually depicts, is a specific, named artifact, the flaming sword of Grob Gob Glob Grod, a spiked light blue blade wrapped in a darker blue flame, fitted to a red hilt, shown clearly enough in flashback that there's no ambiguity about its design or its role in banishing one of the most powerful cosmic entities the show ever introduces down onto a planet where gravity alone was enough to crush him into the shape of a small, forgetful penguin. And then, having done that single, enormous piece of work, the sword simply disappears from the story. It's never shown again in any other confrontation with any other cosmic threat. Never drawn in defense of Mars during any of the later crises the show puts Grob Gob Glob Grod through. Never even referenced by name again once the flashback that introduces it has finished playing. The show's own compiled lore notes this discrepancy plainly, stating outright that what became of the sword after Glob's own apparent sacrifice later in the series remains unknown. It's a small detail, admittedly, sitting well outside the emotional core of anything we've discussed tonight, but it fits a pattern worth naming out loud, because we've now run into it 3 or 4 separate times across a single evening. This show's extraordinarily comfortable introducing an object, a character, a piece of world building capable of enormous consequence, using it exactly once for exactly the purpose the story needs in that moment, and then simply setting it back down and walking away from it forever, trusting that its single appearance was enough, that it doesn't owe the audience a second scene just because a weapon that powerful would, in most other stories, become a recurring fixture. The flaming sword did its one job and vanished, whether it still exists somewhere, waiting, the way the new Finn sword waits in the branches of a tree for whoever eventually finds it, or whether it was lost, destroyed, or simply forgotten, the way so much of this show's own deepest history gets forgotten by the very characters who lived through it, is a question with no answer anywhere in the available material. And I think, by this point in the night, that absence has started to feel like less of an oversight and more like the show's actual, consistent philosophy about how power moves through a very long history. It appears when it's needed, and then it goes quiet, and mostly nobody thinks to ask where it went. Before we leave Mars behind entirely, there's one more thread hanging off that same episode, small enough that most viewers scroll right past it, strange enough that it deserves its own moment once you actually stop and look at it. In a much later episode called All the Little People, King Man, the same character we just watched, give up 200 years of exile, a marriage, and eventually his old identity entirely, sings a short, almost throwaway song while briefly wearing Jake's borrowed shape, and one line from that song has stuck with fans far longer than the scene around it probably deserves, precisely because of where it seems to point. The line goes, more or less, that the little people get left behind, and the title of the episode itself is a direct echo of that exact phrase, which is the kind of naming choice this show rarely made by accident. Later in that same episode, a hole opens up in the ground, and something small and strange emerges from it, and the shape of that hole is later noted by attentive fans combing through the show's visual continuity to closely resemble a completely different hole shown in an entirely separate, much stranger episode called Mystery Dungeon, one where the Ice King, Nepter, Tree Trunks, a minor character named Shelby, and Lemon Grab all climb out of a similar opening, having apparently passed through a chamber sitting directly above something the show refers to in that other episode only in passing as the ancient sleeping magi of life-giving. Nobody in the show ever properly introduces this ancient sleeping magi. It's named, glimpsed, and then abandoned, the way so much of Adventure Time's underlying mythology gets planted without a promise that it will ever be watered again. But the implication sitting underneath both of these episodes, once you set them side by side, is genuinely strange to sit with. That somewhere beneath the surface of the land of Oo, there exists a slumbering entity, or a class of entities, responsible in some unspecified way for granting life itself, an entity whose domain intersects through matching holes in the ground hundreds of miles and several seasons apart, with a group of small, overlooked, seemingly forgotten beings referred to in a Martian's own half-remembered song as simply the Little People. Whether these are the same little people King Man is singing about, whether the show is drawing a line between an ancient life-giving force on Earth and the family structures of a Martian society exiled and repaired across generations, or whether this is nothing more than a coincidence of animation reused for budget reasons rather than meaning, is something the show never confirms one way or the other. I want to be honest that this is speculative territory built entirely from visual pattern matching rather than stated dialogue, the kind of connection that lives or dies on whether you believe a show. This carefully constructed reuses specific, unusual imagery by accident. Given everything else we've walked through tonight, I don't think it does. But I also can't hand you a confirmed answer, because the show never gave one, and I'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend otherwise. There's one more piece of this Martian mythology worth sitting with before we move on, and it's less a plot mystery than a question about the basic nature of one of this show's strangest characters, a question the show raises simply by how it chose to produce him. Grob Gob Glob Grod is not, technically, four separate gods sharing a single throne. He is presented consistently as one being, one body, one name spoken as a single unbroken word, who happens to have four heads, and the show made the unusual choice of casting four different voice actors to perform those four heads individually, each one apparently capable of speaking with something close to its own personality, its own timing, its own reactions to a given scene, even while remaining, by every stated rule of the show's universe, one single entity rather than four. When he expresses worry about Magic Man's grief compromising the family's defense system, it isn't clear whether that worry originates from one particular head and gets voiced through the others, or whether all four heads are independently arriving at the same concern in the same moment. The way four people who know each other intimately might all reach for the same worried thought at once without needing to discuss it first. The show never explains the internal architecture of his consciousness. It never clarifies whether he experiences himself as one mind observing four points of view simultaneously, or four minds cooperating so closely they've simply stopped noticing the seams between them. I find this worth pausing on because of how directly it echoes something else this same mythology does elsewhere, something the show's own compiled lore explicitly draws a line toward without ever making the connection into a stated fact. Grub Gob Glob Grod's multi-headed structure is repeatedly compared by people cataloging the show's visual references to a handful of real-world, multi-faced deities, the Hindu god Brahma, the Slavic god Svetovid, figures out of the Book of Ezekiel, and, more pointedly for our purposes tonight, to Golb, the chaos entity whose own nature the show treats as fundamentally plural, fundamentally resistant to being pinned down as a single coherent personality with a single coherent will. Whether Grob Gob Glob Grod and Golb share some deeper, unstated kinship, two different expressions of the same underlying principle of divided, multiplicitous divinity, or whether the resemblance is simply an aesthetic echo with no cosmological weight behind it, is a question the show leaves entirely open. What's confirmed, and what I think is genuinely strange enough to sit with on its own even without stretching toward GOLB, is that one of the most powerful, most trusted, most fundamentally decent higher powers in this entire mythology, a being who ultimately inherits Mars's throne and rules it by the show's own account quite well, is a character whose basic first-person experience of being a single self is something the show never once bothers to clarify, choosing instead to simply let four voices speak as one and trust the audience not to need the mechanics explained. Let's turn towards something a little closer to the ground, a little more intimate in scale, though no less strange once you actually look at it directly. Death, in Adventure Time, is a character, not a metaphor, and not an off-screen force, a specific being who rules over the land of the dead and its associated dead worlds, who can be visited, negotiated with, occasionally even defeated in a contest, and who looks, deliberately, like a figure out of an old western, a sun-bleached, hornless steer skull for a head, a wide-brimmed hat, an outfit that belongs more to a desert frontier than to any traditional imagining of the Grim Reaper. Concept art from the show's development reveals that Death was originally sketched as something closer to a Japanese cosmic alien, with a design lineage that traces back toward classic tokusatsu villain aesthetics, before the show settled on the Old West version that eventually made it to screen, a small, easily overlooked piece of production history that tells you something about how much reinvention even the show's cosmic tier characters went through before landing on their final shape. Death's powers, as the show demonstrates them across several appearances, are strange in a way that rewards close attention. He can teleport people using beams cast from his own eyes. He can travel freely between nearly every dead world in his domain, with one notable exception, the 50th dead world, which requires someone from inside that specific realm to grant him access, a limitation the show states plainly and then never explains, leaving open the obvious, unanswered question of what exactly is happening in that one particular afterlife that even death himself can't simply walk into uninvited. He can restore lost memories through something called the kiss of death, a single gesture capable of undoing the effects of drinking from the river of forgetfulness, which raises its own quiet, uncomfortable question about how many characters across Oo might be walking around missing pieces of themselves that only death has the power to give back, and how few of them will ever think to ask him. I want to sit with that particular ability a moment longer than the show itself ever does, because once you know it exists, it's hard not to hold it up against nearly everything else we've spent tonight discussing. Simon Petrikov spends 1,000 years losing himself to a crown, forgetting Marceline, forgetting Betty, forgetting the specific shape of his own handwriting on notes he wrote to people he loved. Marceline spends centuries carrying memories nobody else survived to share with her, memories she can't hand off to anyone, because there's simply nobody left from that era who remembers the same things she does. And somewhere in this same mythology, there exists a being who could, in principle, walk up to either of them and simply restore whatever's been lost, the same way he restored a princess's memory after she'd been touched by the river of forgetfulness in an entirely unrelated episode. The show never has him offer this to Simon. It never has him offer this to Marceline. He appears to Simon exactly once in the episode Betty, and the offer he makes there isn't memory restoration at all. It's an offer of death itself, a clean, permanent escape from the crown's curse, which Simon refuses, choosing instead to keep living as whatever the crown has made of him rather than end things outright. Whether death's memory-restoring kiss was even a tool available to him in that scene, whether it could have undone what the crown had already done to Simon's mind, or whether the crown's specific magic sits outside whatever mechanism the river of forgetfulness uses, is never addressed either way. It's entirely possible the two forms of forgetting simply aren't the same cut of forgetting, one a curse and one a natural feature of a specific afterlife river, incompatible with each other by the show's own unstated rules. But the show never says so directly, and the gap between what death is shown to be capable of in one corner of this mythology and what he declines to offer in another sits there, quietly, unresolved, the entire time you're watching him decline to help the one man in this whole story who might have needed exactly that kind of help most. And he settles disputes, at least on occasion, through music. Death plays drums and bass, situates his musical identity somewhere in the neighborhood of death metal, a joke about himself he seems entirely aware of and entirely comfortable making, and in at least one encounter challenges a mortal to a musical contest for the fate of a soul, with the explicit, stated consequence for losing being execution inside an energy prison, flames summoned from his own skull to finish the job. It's a strange mechanism for settling matters of life and death, more strange than menacing on its surface, and yet the show never plays it as anything less than genuinely dangerous. The comedy of a skeletal cowboy demanding a drum off doesn't erase the fact that losing means dying. Both things are true in the same scene, the same trick the Lincoln episode pulls, deployed again here in miniature. The specific parallel worth flagging, clearly as interpretation rather than confirmed lore, is the resemblance between Death's design and behavior and a specific figure out of Venezuelan folklore called El Silbón, the Whistler, a tall, pale figure dressed in white who appears only when someone is about to die, whose most common origin story involves a son murdering his own father and being cursed by his mother as punishment. That detail becomes considerably more interesting once you learn that Adventure Time's own mythology eventually introduces a figure called New Death in the distant lands special Together Again, whose story bears its own echo of a son's fraught relationship to a father figure standing in for Death's role, the show quietly reproducing, likely deliberately, the shape of the very folklore its design seems to be drawing from, in a special that most casual viewers watched as a straightforward, moving reunion story between Finn and Jake, and never clocked as also being a piece of careful, layered mythological engineering underneath. There's a complication sitting right next to Death that almost nobody talks about, because it requires noticing that the show, at different points, gives us two entirely separate characters who both seem to occupy the same conceptual territory without ever acknowledging each other. Early in the series, in an episode simply called Wizard, Finn and Jake encounter a completely different skeletal figure, credited in the show's own materials only as Reaper, who offers them a shot at free wizard powers in exchange for stopping a meteor from striking a wizard academy. This Reaper hassles Finn over the terms of the deal, snaps off his own arm to make it into a keychain as a kind of casual party trick, and later offers the boys a demon's heart as a parting gift. He reappears once more, briefly, in a much later episode called Dungeon, wearing a purple cloak, and then effectively disappears from the show for good. Nothing about his design, his behavior, or his stated role connects him explicitly to Death. In fact, the show's own compiled lore states plainly that despite the obvious surface resemblance, a skeletal figure drawn from the same broad well of Grim Reaper iconography, Reaper appears to have no confirmed relation to the character Death at all. Some fan cataloging even suggests he may be a lich in the classical fantasy sense of an undead spellcaster, possibly connected to the wizard Bufo as some kind of subordinate or minion, rather than any kind of cosmic authority over dying itself, which means Adventure Time, somewhere in its early seasons, introduced a completely separate character who looks like it should logically be the show's version of the Grim Reaper, gave him one memorable minor episode, and then simply let him wander off into background continuity forever, while a different, considerably more developed character, the actual Death, with his desert palace and his memory-restoring kiss, and his son's difficult inheritance, quietly became the show's real cosmic authority on the subject a season or two later. The show never puts these two figures in the same room. It never has one reference the other, never clarifies whether Reaper answers to Death, works independently of him, or exists in some entirely different cosmological department the show never got around to naming. It's a genuine loose end, the kind that tends to happen naturally in any long-running show built by a large, shifting writer's room across a full decade, an idea introduced early, half developed, and then quietly superseded by a stronger version of the same concept without anyone ever going back to formally reconcile the two. I don't think there's a hidden answer waiting to be found here, so much as there's an honest seam in the show's own construction, visible if you're looking for it, invisible if you're not. A reminder that even a mythology, this carefully built, still has the fingerprints of ordinary television production pressed into its foundation somewhere. What never gets addressed at anywhere in the show, and what I think is the genuinely open question worth sitting with here, is what happens structurally when death himself is replaced. New death exists. The show tells us that much, plainly, inside, Together Again. But it never tells us what became of the original death we'd been watching for seasons before that point. Whether he retired, whether he was defeated, whether New Death is simply a title passed down the way Vampire Queen passed from one holder to the next, or whether something considerably darker happened that the show simply never had the runtime to dramatize on screen. It's the kind of succession question that ordinarily drives an entire arc in other stories. Who holds the role of death, how the role changes hands, what it costs the person who inherits it. And Adventure Time simply hands you the fact of a transition already complete, without ceremony, without explanation, and trusts you to feel the strangeness of that gap rather than resolve it for you. The place all of this new death material actually comes from deserves its own space here, because it's a piece of the franchise that tends to get less attention than it should, sitting slightly outside the main series in a way that makes it easy to skip past. In 2020, 4 specials aired under the banner Adventure Time Distant Lands, made specifically to explore corners of U's history and future that the original 10 seasons never had the runtime to properly visit. The third of these specials, called Together Again, is the one that finally directly addresses something the main series had only ever hinted at through a single tattoo glimpsed on Finn's chest in passing. That Jake, at some point after the events of the original finale, dies. The special doesn't announce this with fanfare. It opens with Finn, visibly older than we ever saw him in the main series, and it slowly becomes clear through behavior and context rather than explicit exposition that he's navigating a version of U his best friend is no longer part of. The special's back half shifts into an afterlife sequence, and the show marks that shift the way it always marks its most significant tonal pivots, through the animation itself, moving into a more surreal, abstract visual register that signals, wordlessly, that the ordinary rules of the world we've been watching no longer apply. Finn and Jake are reunited inside this altered space, and the reunion is handled with real, unguarded joy, the kind the show rarely allows itself without some shadow crossing it. And yet the special never once pretends the years of separation or the fact of Jake's death itself weren't real and weren't painful. It holds both at once, joy and loss occupying the same frame without either one canceling the other, which by this point in the night should feel like a familiar trick, because it's the same one the show pulled with Lincoln's sacrifice, the same one it pulled with Death's music battles, deployed here one final time in what amounts to a goodbye. It's inside this same special that the show introduces its new death and gives him a small, specific piece of family drama that the special treats with more weight than its comedic surface initially suggests. Without spoiling the particular emotional mechanics of how that drama resolves, it's worth noting plainly that the special constructs a story about inheritance, about a son and a father figure standing in an uneasy relationship to each other across the boundary of death itself, echoing, likely deliberately given everything else. This franchise borrows and reworks from older mythology, the same folkloric shape underneath El Silbón that we touched on a few minutes ago, a legend built around a son's violence toward a father and the supernatural consequence that follows. Whether the show's writers set out consciously to reproduce that specific legend structure or arrived at a similar shape simply because certain emotional patterns around fathers, sons, and death recur naturally across unrelated storytelling traditions is something no interview on record actually confirms. But the echo is there, sitting quietly underneath a special that most casual viewers watched purely as a moving reunion story and nothing more. What the special never tells us, and what remains genuinely unresolved even after this direct, dedicated look at Death's own household, is what actually happened to the original Death we'd spent years watching across the main series. The same skeletal figure who challenged Simon with an offer of escape from the crown's curse in the episode Betty. The same one who mocked Abraham Lincoln's penny before ultimately accepting his immortality instead. The same one whose steer skull silhouette had, by this point, become as familiar a piece of this show's cosmology as Prismo's yellow cube or the Nightosphere's red horizon. New Death simply exists, inheriting the role, inheriting the throne of the land of the dead, and the special is far more interested in what that inheritance costs him emotionally than in explaining, mechanically, how or why the transfer of the role happened in the first place. It's a choice that feels entirely consistent with everything else we've walked through tonight. A show that consistently cared more about what an unresolved loss does to the people left standing near it than about supplying a clean, mechanical explanation for how the loss occurred. Let's shift again, because there's a thread running through Marceline's story that gets far less attention than her relationship with Simon or her long, slow reconciliation with Princess Bubblegum, and it deserves its own space here, clearly separated from those more famous threads, because it opens onto a piece of the show's cosmology that barely gets discussed at all. Marceline did not start her long life as a vampire. She started it as a half-demon, half-human child, orphaned by circumstances the show only partially details, surviving the ruined landscape left behind by the Mushroom War with whatever resourcefulness a child in that situation could manage, eventually falling under the protection, however imperfect and eventually abandoned, of Simon Petrikov. Her transformation into a vampire happens later, and it happens through violence rather than through any choice she consciously made in advance. At some point in her early life, Marceline discovers that by using her demonic heritage to kill vampires, she can absorb their souls and, with them, their specific powers, a genuinely disturbing mechanic when you sit with it directly. since it means every ability she carries into the modern day events of the show represents, at minimum, one previous death she caused and consumed. She works her way up through a loosely structured vampire hierarchy. Figures with names like the Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon, each one a title lifted directly from tarot imagery, each one representing both a rank within vampire society and a specific archetype the show maps onto their design and behavior, until eventually she confronts the vampire king himself, the ruler at the top of that hierarchy, and in the process of finally defeating him, gets bitten and turned into a vampire herself. She becomes, immediately and by simple consequence of having killed every other vampire capable of contesting the claim, the last of her kind, and takes the title Vampire Queen not through any ceremony or coronation, but simply because there was, by the time the fighting stopped, nobody left to hold the title instead of her. This alone is worth sitting with as its own kind of quiet tragedy, a title inherited through extermination rather than succession, a queen crowned by attrition. And it's worth pausing on the tarot structure sitting underneath the vampires Marceline defeated on her way to that crown, because the show clearly put more thought into it than it ever explains on screen. The Fool, the Empress, the Hierophant, the Moon, each one isn't just a vaguely ominous title borrowed for atmosphere. Each corresponds to a specific card in a traditional tarot deck, and each of those cards carries its own established symbolic weight in the systems the show is quoting from, weight the show trusts you to either already know or go looking for on your own, since it never once explains the connection out loud. The Vampire King himself is tied explicitly through his own design and behavior to the Wheel of Fortune, a card about change, about the inevitability of a turning cycle nobody fully controls, about accepting a shift in circumstance, whether or not you asked for it. It's a quietly perfect card to hang on a character whose entire arc is about the end of an old order and the reluctant acceptance of a new one. A king who ultimately admits he doesn't even want to be a vampire anymore and asks Marceline's help to be rid of it. Whether the writers worked outward from the tarot symbolism to build each vampire's personality, or worked inward from an already written personality to find the card that fitted afterward, is something no interview I could find on record actually settles, which makes it its own small, quiet mystery, sitting underneath the much louder one. The detail that opens up the real mystery here comes from the show's own multiverse, specifically from an alternate timeline referred to as Vampire World, glimpsed across a small handful of episodes and specials. In that alternate reality, Simon Petrikov never survives the Mushroom War at all, killed early by vampires rather than protected by a crown he never gets the chance to put on. The orphaned Marceline of that timeline is found instead by the Vampire King himself, who raises her as his own adopted daughter, trains her, and eventually turns her into a vampire far earlier and far more deliberately than the version we watch in the main timeline. Together, this Vampire King and his adopted Marceline conquer the entirety of Oo, and, this is the detail that matters most, this alternate Vampire King ends up in possession of the Ice Crown, using its power not to sustain his own life the way Simon eventually needed it to, but simply to permanently block out the sun, allowing his kind to walk freely at any hour, day or night, forever. And he shows none of the crown's usual effects. No slow erosion of self, no creeping madness, no physical transformation, no loss of memory or identity stretching out across centuries. The show acknowledges this discrepancy directly through its own supplementary material, offering exactly two possible explanations and confirming neither: that his vampiric nature somehow makes him immune to the crown's specific curse, or that somewhere else in that alternate vampire world there exists another, unseen host bearing the actual psychological cost of the crown's power, while this vampire king simply wears it as an ornament, untouched by whatever mechanism usually extracts a price from whoever puts it on. Nobody in the show ever confirms which explanation is correct, or whether there's a third explanation neither piece of material has offered. It's presented plainly as an open contradiction. The same crown that unmade Simon Petrikov over 1,000 slow years apparently does nothing at all to this alternate version of a very different man. And the show simply lets that contradiction sit there unresolved, a genuine gap in a mythology that is otherwise almost obsessively careful about the internal consistency of its magic system. If you want a piece of honest speculation rather than settled fact, here's mine, offered exactly as speculation and nothing more. The crown's true curse, going all the way back to its origin with the ice elemental Urgent's evergreen and the small assistant whose desperate wish to be like his mentor shaped the artifact's fundamental nature, was never really about ice powers at all. It was about the specific psychological cost of wanting, badly enough, to become something other than what you already are. Simon put the crown on hoping, at least in part, to be someone capable of protecting the people he loved in circumstances that terrified him. That specific, desperate bond of wanting seems to be exactly what the crown feeds on and punishes. A vampire king who already considers himself powerful, who wears the crown as decoration rather than desperation, who wants nothing from it beyond a convenient trick for blocking sunlight, may simply never trigger whatever mechanism the crown is actually built around. That's a theory, not a confirmed answer, offered because it's the closest thing I can find to a shape that fits the available evidence, and I want to be clear that the show itself never says any of this in so many words. We're going to go somewhere stranger now, into a piece of mythology that most casual viewers of this show never even notice exists, tucked into the corner of a single arc late in the series. Easy to miss if you're watching for plot rather than watching for texture. Finn loses his right arm partway through the show's run in an encounter involving the Lich and a grass sword that had, unbeknownst to Finn, been slowly growing around and merging with his actual arm across several prior episodes. What eventually regrows in its place isn't simply flesh and bone returned to normal. It's the product of a strange fusion between that original grass sword and something called the Finn sword, a separate magical artifact from a collapsed alternate timeline, one that, in its own branch of the multiverse, actually contained a small, complete version of Finn living inside it, trapped and conscious, able to speak directly to the primary Finn once the two blades finally merged into one weapon. The being that emerges from this fusion is Fern, sometimes called Grass Finn, a fully independent person who initially believes, with total sincerity, that he is the real Finn, carrying every one of Finn's memories up until the moment of his own creation, right down to the specific texture of feelings and relationships that make a person who they are, rather than simply what they look like. Fern's arc across the show's final stretch is genuinely one of its more philosophically ambitious pieces of writing, and I don't want to retread ground that's already been well covered elsewhere on this channel. What I want to focus on instead is the detail sitting at the very end of his story, well past the point where most summaries of his arc stop paying attention. Fern dies. Twice, actually, across the show's final season, the second time permanently, sacrificing himself inside a shared dream to destroy the grass demon that had been sustaining and corrupting his existence, choosing, in his final act, to make sure a better version of himself gets to keep living rather than fighting to preserve his own continuation. What's left of him afterward isn't nothing. His remains take the shape of a seed, formed like a miniature version of the Finn sword itself, and Finn plants that seed at the site of the destroyed tree fort, where it grows over what the show implies is a span of many years, into an enormous tree, with a newly formed Finn sword eventually resting somewhere in its highest branches. There's a piece of Fern's origin that deserves more weight than it usually gets, because it sits right at the intersection of two things this show does constantly and almost never in combination: genuine cosmic dread and a punchline. When Fern finally tracks down his creator, a minor, largely comic figure called the Grassy Wizard, hoping for some explanation of why he exists, what he's for, what larger purpose might justify the confusion and violence of his own accidental birth, the answer he receives is almost cruelly small. The Grassy Wizard tells him, more or less, that the grass sword was built for no reason beyond sounding cool, a pun, a bit of wordplay, an artifact conjured into being because grass sword has a nice ring to it and nothing more. There's no grand design underneath Fern's existence, no prophecy, no destiny, no secret purpose waiting to be revealed later in the story. He is, quite literally, the byproduct of someone else's throwaway joke, brought unwillingly into consciousness, memory, and eventually love and grief and self-sacrifice, entirely because a wizard thought a name sounded neat centuries ago. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the exact same shape as the show's own origin story, the one we didn't spend time on tonight, because it's the single most well-covered piece of Adventure Time lore there is. The fact that the show's entire post-apocalyptic mythology, the businessmen frozen in an iceberg, the ruins scattered through every background, the whole architecture of grief this franchise is built on, began as an offhand joke. A much younger version of this same writer's room threw into an early episode without any plan for what it might become. Fern's creation myth is the show quaintly retelling its own creation myth in miniature, compressed into a single wizard's shrug, and then, crucially, refusing to let that smallness of origin diminish what Fern eventually becomes. A joke about a cool sounding sword produces a person capable of real love, real fear, real self sacrifice. In exactly the same way, a joke about frozen businessmen produced an entire mythology capable of making grown adults think about their own dying fathers. The show seems to believe, quite sincerely, across both of these examples, that meaning doesn't require a meaningful origin. It can be built entirely out of what happens after the accident, regardless of how small or thoughtless the accident itself was. What never gets resolved, though, and what I think is worth naming honestly as an open question rather than folding neatly into that theme, is whether the grassy wizard's own account of his motives is even reliable. He's a minor character, played mostly for comedy, encountered only briefly, and the show gives us no particular reason to trust that his stated reasoning represents the full truth of what he was doing when he built the sword in the first place. Wizards in this mythology are, by Betty's own research, prone to madness and self-deception in ways that might make a wizard's account of his own motivations exactly the kind of thing worth doubting. Maybe the grassy wizard really did build the sword for nothing more than the pun. Or maybe there was something else underneath that reasoning that even he no longer has access to, buried the same way Simon's own past got buried under the crown's slow erasure, a wizard's real motive, lost to his own particular flavor of magic, born madness long before Fern ever came along to ask him about it. The show gives us no way to tell the difference, and I think that ambiguity is worth sitting with rather than resolving in either direction. Here's where the mystery actually lives. Deep into the future depicted in the show's epilogue material, long after the main timeline has ended, two new characters named Shermie and Beth find that sword at the top of that same tree. The show's own wiki, compiling everything stated on screen, is explicit that it remains genuinely unknown whether that reborn Finn sword carries any of the same mystical properties the original did, and, this is the detail that matters most, whether Shermie, its new owner, might in some sense be a reincarnation of Finn himself, continuing the same cycle the show spent its final seasons establishing through the Catalyst Comet mythology, in which the cosmic force of heroism has apparently chosen to incarnate more than once across history, never confined to a single lifetime or a single body. Nobody in the show confirms this. There is no scene, no line of dialogue, no framing that states plainly that Shermie is Finn come again. It's a possibility the material itself leaves open, deliberately, at the very edge of what the show ever chose to show us, a final unanswered thread stretching past the point where the cameras stop following anyone at all. Every piece of evidence points toward a cycle. The blue comet choosing new forms across new eras, a sword grown from Fern's sacrifice, ending up in new hands generations later, the show's own persistent interest in inheritance and continuation over static, permanent endings. But evidence pointing toward a pattern isn't the same as confirmation, and the show, characteristically, declines to close the loop for you. It hands you the shape of the question and lets you carry it the rest of the way yourself. There's one more piece of Marceline's long history worth pulling into the light before we move past her, and it comes from the second of those same Distant Lands specials, the one called Obsidian, built around Marceline and Princess Bubblegum, and set largely in the years after the main series concludes. In it, the two of them travel to a place called the Glass Kingdom to help defend against a dragon threatening the people living there, and the special reveals, almost in passing, that Marceline is regarded by the residents of this kingdom as something close to a saint on account of having defeated this exact same dragon once before, centuries earlier, long before the main series ever began. The show doesn't dwell on this. It's delivered as a piece of set dressing, a way of establishing Marceline's long history and lived-in relationship to corners of who the main series never had time to show us, and then the special moves on to its actual emotional business, which is the specific, hard-won reconciliation between Marceline and Bubblegum that this special exists to deliver. But the detail itself opens onto a question the show never circles back to answer. How many places like the Glass Kingdom exist scattered across holding on to their own private legends about a vampire woman who saved them once, centuries ago, and then moved on, the way she's apparently moved on from countless other corners of this world across a millennium of survival, most of which the show simply never had the runtime to show us. We know, from scattered lines across the main series, that Marceline has ridden goldfish beasts, traveled to the Fire Kingdom, held more addresses than she can easily list, accumulated a life far larger and stranger than the relatively narrow slice of it the show's 10 seasons actually depict. Obsidian's dragon is the one piece of that enormous, largely unseen life we happen to get real confirmation of, a single lit window in a house otherwise standing dark, and it raises, without ever answering, the much larger question of what the rest of that house actually contains. 1,000 years is a very long time to fill with adventures a show can only ever show you a handful of, and Obsidian's dragon is really just proof that the gaps in Marceline's own history are exactly as large as they've always looked. I want to turn now towards something considerably larger in scope, something that reframes not just one character's story, but the underlying rules governing everything we've talked about so far tonight. Because in the years since the original series ended, Adventure Time quietly revealed that its own fictional device, the running joke about the Ice King's embarrassing fan fiction, was never actually fiction within its own universe at all. For the entire original run of the show, Fiona and Cake existed as a gag. The Ice King, lonely and unstable, and grasping for any way to process feelings he couldn't otherwise articulate, wrote and drew fan fiction imagining gender-swapped versions of Finn and Jake, populating an alternate land of called with counterparts to nearly every character the audience already knew. A girl named Fiona in place of Finn, a cat named Cake in place of Jake, a Prince Gumball standing where Princess Bubblegum stood, a Marshall Lee standing where Marceline stood. The show played this almost entirely for laughs. It was a window into the Ice King's inner life, a little sad, a little embarrassing, clearly understood by every character who encountered it as pure invention, the pathetic creative output of a man too broken to write anything else. Then, In the spin off series that eventually bears their names, Adventure Time, Fiona, and Cake, the show pulled the floor out from under that entire premise. Fiona and Cake and the whole of their world were real all along, not metaphorically, not as some abstract meditation on the power of imagination, but literally, physically real, an entire functioning universe with its own history and its own inhabitants living genuine lives. The being responsible for this turns out to be Prismo, the wish-granting entity who has appeared throughout the show's mythology as a cheerful, slightly detached cosmic bureaucrat operating out of the time room. Prismo, it's revealed, became curious what it would be like to build a universe of his own, rather than simply granting universes into existence at other people's request, the way his job normally requires. And because creating a personal universe for himself, specifically, wasn't something he was authorized to do, he hid the entire thing inside Simon Petrikov's mind. Back during the years Simon was still lost inside the Ice King's fractured, damaged psyche, using that broken, empty space as a kind of secret storage container nobody else would ever think to search. Follow the implications of that for a moment, because they run in a few different directions, and none of the show's other characters ever seem to notice most of them. When Simon is finally healed in the original series finale, freed from the crown, and restored to his full, coherent self, Fiona's entire universe loses its magic simultaneously, its inhabitants transformed overnight into non-magical humans living something closer to an ordinary contemporary city, their memories of their previous magical lives quietly erased in the same stroke, an entire population's worth of people losing themselves, not because of anything they did, but because a man they never met, in a universe they didn't know existed, got better. It's an almost unbearably strange piece of collateral damage, tucked inside what the original finale otherwise plays as a moment of pure, hard-won triumph. Simon's healing, the emotional high point of the entire series, comes with a cost that the original finale has no way of showing you, because it doesn't yet know Fiona's world is real, and the cost only becomes visible years later in an entirely different show, watched by an entirely different audience, most of whom never connect the two events at all. There's a further complication layered on top of this, introduced later in the spin-off itself, an entity called the Scarab, described as a kind of cosmic auditor, whose job is apparently to track down and eliminate unauthorized universes exactly like the one Prismo secretly built. Prismo spends a portion of the spin-off in genuine, stated fear of being discovered by his own supervisor, aware that what he did constitutes some kind of violation with consequences he clearly doesn't want to face, which raises a question the show gestures toward without ever answering in full. What governs the creation of universes in this cosmology? Who authorizes it? What happens to the ones that don't get sanctioned? Prismo's own boss is referenced, but barely characterized. The rules of this cosmic bureaucracy are treated the way most bureaucracies are treated, by the people forced to live under them, mostly invisible, occasionally terrifying, never fully explained to the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, who are simply expected to follow rules whose full shape they're never shown. It helps, at this point, To understand just how large the show eventually revealed this multiverse to actually be, because Fiona's world is far from the only universe glimpsed briefly and then left almost entirely uncatalogued. When the sword of the Enchiridion is turned sideways in certain episodes, it displays a holographic map of every known universe the show's mythology has established, each one represented by its own distinct three-dimensional shape, connected to its neighbors by visible lines. The show never asks any character to fully explain. Beyond Fiona's world and the farm world reality, where Simon dies stopping the mushroom bomb, the show has quietly confirmed the existence of a whole scattering of other realities, most of them visited for a single scene, a single joke, and never again. There's a place called the Grotto World, reachable through a literal grotto near Finn and Jake's own treehouse, created by one of Prismo's wishes so long ago that even Prismo himself, by his own admission, can no longer remember who made the original wish that brought it into being. There's a water park world, which nobody realized was a genuine alternate universe, rather than simply a location within the primary timeline, until Simon briefly passes through it while trying to find his way home in the Fiona and Cake finale. There's a baby world where every inhabitant exists permanently as an infant, watched over by protective gumball guardians, functioning as an entire society's babysitters. There's a winter world, glimpsed across two entirely separate stories years apart, where Ice King and Princess Bubblegum's roles are swapped, his madness transferred into her instead. And there's even, strangest of all in a very different way, a universe corresponding to an entirely separate Cartoon Network show called Flapjack, folded into this same multiverse without ever needing a wish to summon it into existence in the first place, simply existing as its own independent point of light on that same holographic map. None of these get more than a scene or two of screen time across the entire run of the franchise. None of them get an origin story, a central conflict, a named protagonist whose life we're meant to follow the way we follow Fiona's. They exist, as far as the show is concerned, purely as evidence, proof that the multiverse the writers built is vastly larger than any single story could ever explore, that Fiona's world becoming real wasn't a unique, isolated exception to an otherwise closed system, but simply the one instance where the show happened to have enough runtime left to actually walk through the door it had built. Somewhere out past the edge of every episode we've ever watched, that map keeps extending, full of shapes with names we'll never learn, holding entire populations of characters who will never get so much as a single line of dialogue, all of it simply implied, simply present, simply true within the logic of a universe built specifically to never run out of room for one more shape on the map. There's a smaller detail buried inside this same revelation that deserves its own moment, because it opens up yet another layer of unexplained hierarchy sitting above everything else we've discussed tonight. Prismo doesn't just fear the scarab directly. He fears what the scarab will do once it reports him, specifically, to what the show refers to only as Prismo's boss, a figure who is mentioned by name only, in passing, never seen, never characterized, beyond the simple fact of existing and apparently holding some kind of authority over Prismo himself. This is, when you actually stop and think about it, a genuinely strange thing for this particular mythology to contain. Prismo is one of the most powerful entities the show ever introduces, a being capable of granting literal wishes, observing the entire structure of the multiverse from a vantage point outside ordinary time, hosting parties attended by four-headed Martian gods as casual guests. And above him, apparently, sits someone else. Someone whose displeasure Prismo genuinely dreads. Someone the show never gives a face, a name beyond the vague title of boss, or a single line of dialogue across the entire run of the franchise. It would be easy to read this as nothing more than a throwaway joke, the kind of casual world-building flourish this show tosses off constantly without expecting anyone to take it especially seriously. The wish-granting cosmic entity has a boss. Huh? Funny. Moving on. And maybe that's all it is. But given everything else we've spent tonight walking through, given a mythology this consistently willing to let its funniest details double as its most genuinely unsettling ones, I don't think it costs much to sit with the alternative for a moment. That somewhere above Prismo, above the time room, above the entire visible structure of gods and wishes and multiverses this show ever bothered to map for us, there exists at least one more layer of authority the story never once let us see. We don't know what it wants. We don't know what it looks like, whether it experiences time the way Prismo does, or exists somewhere even further outside its ordinary flow, whether it has ever intervened directly in any of the events we've spent all these hours discussing tonight, or whether it simply watches, the way Prismo himself watches, cheerful and detached, from a perch high enough above the land of Oo that nothing happening down here has ever seemed worth stepping in for. And this is where I want to leave you with the biggest open question of the night, one that the show has never addressed directly and, as far as I know, has no plans to. If Prismo could hide an entire genuine universe inside one damaged human mind, using that mind's brokenness as cover, as a kind of blind spot nobody else thought to check, how many other minds across this show's 10-season run might be hiding something similar? Every wizard touched by Betty's theory of magic, madness, and sadness. Every character whose psychology the show marks as fractured, incomplete, or altered by trauma and power in ways left conspicuously underexplained. The Lich's own centuries of possession and dormancy. Magic Man's 200 years of grief-curdled madness. Even Marceline's long, guarded silences about pieces of her own past the show never fully opens up. None of this is confirmed. I want to be entirely clear that this is speculation built outward from a single stated mechanic, extended into territory the show itself has never gone. But once you know that a real populated universe can hide inside a broken mind without anyone noticing for 1,000 years, it becomes very hard to look at any of this show's damaged, mysterious characters the same way again. And I think that's precisely the kind of unease Adventure Time was always most interested in leaving behind in its audience. Not answers, but a permanently altered way of looking at everything that came before. There's something worth naming plainly before we start to come down from all of this. Something about the specific shape these particular mysteries take compared to the ones that usually get discussed. Most conversations about unsolved Adventure Time lore gravitate toward the show's biggest, loudest gaps. What exactly caused the Mushroom War? Who Susan Strong really is? What's inside the Door Lord's collection? Those are real questions, and they deserve the attention they get. But the ones we've spent tonight with are quieter than that, tucked into corners rather than standing at the center of the frame. A cryptid in a family photograph nobody was ever meant to notice. A contradiction between two pieces of licensed material that most casual fans will never read side by side. A single, unexplained line about a prophecy delivered once and never mentioned again. A crown that behaves differently depending on who's desperate enough to want something from it. A sword sitting in the branches of a tree, waiting for someone the show never confirms is who you think they might be. A weapon that saved a planet once and then simply disappeared from its own mythology. A boss nobody has ever seen, standing somewhere above a being who can grant literal wishes. Notice, too, how many of tonight's threads turned out to be connected to each other in ways the show itself never draws a line between. Betty's theory of magic, madness, and sadness explains Magic Man's grief, and Magic Man's grief explains the ruined weapon built in his dead wife's shape, and that same grief-soaked family produces the brother who eventually gives up his own throne to protect a dog he barely knows, on the same planet whose ancient defender, cast down by a sword nobody can locate anymore, spent centuries compressed into a penguin's body before finding, of all possible outcomes, a strange kind of peace. Death's steer skull echoes a legend about a father and a son, and that same legend echoes forward into a special about a different father and son. Standing on the far side of a friendship, the main series spent 10 years building brick by brick. A joke about a cool-sounding sword produces a person capable of dying twice for the sake of someone else's better life, in exactly the same way a joke about frozen businessmen produced an entire post-apocalyptic mythology capable of making grown adults think about their own fathers dying. None of these connections are stated outright anywhere in the show. They're the kind of pattern that only becomes visible once you've spent enough hours sitting with all of it at once, turning each piece over separately and then setting them down next to each other and noticing, almost by accident, that they were quietly rhyming with each other the entire time. What strikes me most, sitting with all of this together, is how consistently Adventure Time trusted its gaps to do real work rather than treating them as failures of planning. A lesser show, running for 10 seasons and multiple spin-offs across more than a decade, would eventually feel obligated to close every loop, explain every background detail, justify every strange choice with a tidy piece of retroactive lore. This show mostly didn't. It let the cryptids stay unnamed. It let two versions of Betty's fate sit unreconciled in separate pieces of official material. It let a king of Mars turn to stone and simply stay stone It let a sword disappear after doing exactly one job. It trusted that the not knowing was doing something the knowing couldn't, that a mystery held open a little longer keeps generating meaning precisely because it refuses to resolve into a single fixed answer, the way grief itself refuses to resolve into a single fixed shape. No matter how many times you turn it over, trying to find the version of it you can finally set down. One last loose thread belongs here before we close, because it ties directly back to where tonight began, and it's never quite gotten the attention it deserves on its own. Whatever the truth ends up being about Betty's ultimate fate across the show's tangle of competing continuities, the version confirmed by the original television finale leaves Gold Betty standing, still, somewhere out past the edge of the ordinary multiverse, a fusion of a brilliant, devoted woman and an entity whose entire nature is built around chaos rather than intention. The show's own supplementary material states that she retains something of Betty's own intellect and restraint, that she doesn't instigate destruction the way Golb alone once did, that her presence in the world, however altered, still bends towards something closer to purpose than pure disorder. But what she actually does with that restraint, where she goes, whether she watches over Simon from wherever she now exists, the way she once watched over him from a window before flying off alone on a stolen magic carpet, is never shown again anywhere in the main continuity. She's simply out there, a woman who loved someone enough to give up her own body to protect him, now existing as something too vast and too strange for the story to keep following, present in the same way the ruins of the old world are present in the background of every outdoor scene, real, permanent, felt, and almost entirely out of frame. That's not a flaw in a story like this. It's closer to the whole point. The world of Ooh was built from its very first accidental joke about businessmen frozen in an iceberg, on the idea that the past is mostly inaccessible, mostly unverifiable, held together by fragments and ruins and half-remembered artifacts, rather than by any complete, trustworthy record. A show built on that premise was never going to hand you complete, trustworthy answers about its own internal mysteries either. The unsolved parts aren't oversights. They're the show being honest, one more time, about what it always believed regarding memory and loss and the impossibility of ever fully reconstructing anything that's already gone. So we'll leave the cryptid unnamed. We'll leave both Bettys standing, unreconciled, each one real in her own branch of a multiverse, built specifically to hold contradictions like that without breaking. We'll leave Lincoln as a statue, and Death's 50th dead world locked behind a door nobody outside it can open, and a sword resting in a tree, waiting for whoever climbs us enough to find it. We'll leave a helmet sitting quietly in a small robot's house, a weapon nobody has seen in centuries, and a boss whose face this entire mythology never once bothered to show us. Some rooms are better known by their outline than by their contents, and the land of Ooh, even now, years after its story technically ended, is still full of rooms like that, still waiting, quietly, in the dark, for someone patient enough to notice the shape of what's missing. If tonight sent you looking back through an episode with new eyes, or if it kept you good company while you lay there in the dark thinking about it. That's exactly what this was for. Hit the like button if you've got a second. It genuinely helps this kind of deep, patient work find the people who are actually looking for it, and it tells me it's worth doing more of these. Subscribe if you want to keep coming back. There's a lot more world down here than any one video can hold, and we've barely finished unpacking a fraction of it. The adventure continues. Rest well. Ooh will keep until next time, holding its unsolved rooms exactly as it's always held them, patiently, without apology, in the dark, waiting for whichever one of us comes looking next.